Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I am a USA Today bestselling author with over 30 published novels and a high school English teacher. And on this week's episode, I'm excited to have Sage Vogel. He is a New Mexico writer published through UNM Press, and he's got an unusual book to talk about that's really neat, and I'm excited to get into. So we're going to be discussing dichos and nichos. And Sage, go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners.
Thank you, DelSheree, and thanks so much for having me. I'm excited too. I'm Sage Vogel. I'm a writer from the Vogel Valley in northern New Mexico, and my debut book, my first official release, is coming from the Cadencia series from the University of New Mexico Press, and it's titled Dichos and Nichos. Dichos and Nichos is a collection of 10 short stories. They're kind of interconnected. They have some common characters and a common locale. And these stories were inspired by the rich history and culture of northern New Mexico in general, and my hometown of Dixon specifically. And you mentioned that Dichos and Nichos is kind of unique. And I credit that to the fact that it was created in collaboration with my parents, who are fine artists. Each of the stories is paired with an oil painting depicting a scene from the narrative, painted by my father, Jim Vogel. And each of those paintings is set in what we call a nicho frame, which is a dimensional frame. It's not flat. Some of them are lanterns, some of them are boxes, some of them are cabinets. And these were crafted out of repurposed relics by my mother, Kristen. And both of them have decades of experience doing this and working together. Many of my father's paintings have my mother's frames on them. It's kind of their thing. And we created Dichos and Nichos together, each of us working in tandem in our own medium. And we've collaborated before a number of times, and we're planning on doing so again soon. But this is the first of my books with their artwork that's going to be published.
It is so neat that this was able to be a family project of this nature, because that is one of the themes that we'll get into, is just the relationships within the town, within the families, and just seeing how those change and grow over time. But before we get too far into that, because I'll go off on a million other topics,
Yeah.
tell our listeners, you had a really great introduction at the beginning of the book that goes into kind of explaining the title, as well as some of the cultural aspects, the language aspects. And so I wanted to see if you can kind of give just a brief overview of some of the things people might need to know about the book to help them understand what we're going to be talking about today.
Absolutely. I think the best place to start is, what is a dicho and what is a nicho, for those of you that don't know. A dicho is a folk saying. It's kind of like a proverb, and they normally rhyme. They're normally pithy. They have a clever overtone to it. Many of them are kind of jokey, but some of them are a little bit more serious. And they're passed down from generation to generation. They're activated or dispensed, so to speak, in specific circumstances where they're needed. So it just depends. You could be with an old timer outside and you need some advice, and they'll give you a dicho just catered to your specific circumstance. And I've written at least one dicho for each story, but most of them have more than that. And I've written them in both English and Spanish to help anyone who may not be familiar with Spanish, particularly New Mexico Spanish, because I did use authentic New Mexican vocabulary as often as I could. So that's a dicho. And a nicho is a general term that really describes a small altar or a place or an object even where you place things of value, or maybe a little carving of a saint, flowers, devotional objects, and you can place them, like I said, in a box. Sometimes nichos are carved into walls, and there's this really classic shape of like a rounded top with a flat bottom. And that's like a classic nicho. In dichos and nichos, we refer to all of the frames as the nichos. And so I hope the title makes a little bit more sense now. You're basically looking into a nicho, seeing the story within it, and then experiencing the dichos that are shared by the characters within that scene or within that narrative.
Thank you. That's a wonderful explanation of those. I didn't want to attempt to try to explain it. I knew you could do it better.
I've had a little practice at this point.
Good. Well, and I wanted to ask about the image on the cover, because each of the 10 stories, as you mentioned, has images of the artwork that pairs with the story. And they're so lovely and expressive. What was that like, trying to choose which one was going to go on the cover of the book? Because I imagine that was tough.
Yeah, it wasn't easy. I get asked sometimes which of the artworks is my favorite, and I can't choose. We picked that one with a young character. Her name is Esposa, and she's holding a peach out as an offering. And as soon as you read that story, it all really comes into place. We picked that one, I think, just because it fits really well on the cover. It's a good shape. Some of the other nichos are highly unusual. Some of them are made out of old lanterns, so they have like 6 different panels within them, each with their own painting. And as beautiful as they are, they definitely have more impact in person or when you can see all sides of them rather than just one side. And the peaches one, it just had a great shape to it. It fit really well. And the character within the painting is gazing directly at the viewer. And I think that really increases its impact and its appeal, and it just catches the eye really well. So we knew since the beginning that that was going to be on the cover of the book.
That's great. Yeah, it's really striking, and it does catch your eye. As soon as I opened the package, I was like, oh, wow. Like, this is going to be really interesting to read. So,
Oh, that's great.
wonderful choice.
Thank you.
Now, with the dichos, you said they're kind of like the phrases, the proverbs, the idioms in a way.
Yeah,
And the stories that go with them are not folk tales that you're retelling or recreating. These are your own original stories. And I wanted to make sure that that came across, that this isn't a retelling of stories passed down. So I wanted to ask you about creating the dichos themselves and then the stories that went along with them. How did you approach that, and what was that process like?
I appreciate you clarifying that because there are so many wonderful collections of classic New Mexico stories, and it's great that you clarified that Dichos and Nichos is not specifically that. It was my dad Jim who first pitched the project to me and my mom, and he already had the title ready to go. He already had an idea of what the artwork was going to look like, but at the time he just wanted some bilingual dichos. He wanted me to write a dicho for each of the pieces of art. So really the writing started with me just writing the proverbs, just writing the dichos. And it quickly became apparent to me and my parents as well that dichos really, their impact is tied to the context when they come to life, basically, when the context in which they're spoken. Dicho, the word itself means spoken. It's tied to the words actually being voiced. So I realized that we could just write some dichos and translate them into English and have them on a little note card under the painting. But there was so much more that could be done. There was so much more potential behind the dichos and behind the whole project itself that I decided to just attempt to start writing a story about one of them. And it kind of just snowballed from there and became each of the paintings needed its own story, and it just kind of, our creativity just exploded from there.
That's really neat. Yeah, I was wondering how it all came together and what the process was like, who was kind of, I guess, taking the lead in each one. So that's really neat that it was your dad who proposed it, and then it transformed over the course of creating this collaborative project together.
Right. And that's happened before. We've collaborated on projects before, and pretty consistently they get out of hand. They end up being bigger than we're prepared for. We end up pushing it right up to the deadline of the art show. We end up biting off more than we can chew and then pulling it off at the end anyway. And that seems like it's a consistent part of our practice, actually, at this point.
Everybody works differently, and sometimes that deadline really has some benefits to it and gets things moving along.
Right.
I can
And
understand.
there's something really enjoyable about challenging yourself beyond what you previously thought you were capable of.
Absolutely. Well, and I was curious, what was the outcome for the artwork? Is it on display somewhere, or will it be displayed that people could go and see if they would like to?
The Dichos and Nichos artwork, all but one of them have sold at this point. The first iteration of the stories and the artwork were released in 2020. So it's been a while since then. And like I said, there's only one left. It's a small cabinet from a story called El Intercambio, The Exchange. And that will be on display at my event at Collected Works in Santa Fe on March 23rd at 4:30 p.m. So anyone who comes to that event can see that artwork in person. But otherwise, I'm not sure if there'll ever be an opportunity to see the other ones publicly. We are reaching out to the owners of the art pieces, and we'll wait and see if any of them might want to display them publicly again, but I'm not sure.
Well, I hope people take advantage if they're in the area to see the remaining piece and be able to connect that with the stories. That's a really cool opportunity.
Yeah, I hope so too. And we'll probably bring that specific artwork to my other event at Bookworks in Albuquerque too. So people will have two chances, either in Santa Fe or Albuquerque. And that event is on March 29th at 6 p.m.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you for mentioning those. Well, I wanted to ask about your overall concept for the town. You said it's kind of some basis in reality, but you create a world for these characters to exist in. And throughout the story, it's not one long connected story. They're each individual stories that can be read solo if people wanted to. But you do have connected characters between each of them. So I was curious, did you approach each story individually? Did you have kind of a grander view of what stories you wanted to tell within this town? Or just how did you approach creating these?
Well, I knew they were all going to happen within the same valley, essentially, and they're all within the same time period. But starting out, I didn't anticipate them developing the connections that they did. I really did start them just intending for them to be a separated collection where each of the story stands alone. And they still stand alone, but each of them has multiple threads tying them to other stories. And that kind of just happened, I don't want to say by accident, because I think there's some sort of influence that guides those connections. So I can't say it's by accident, but it definitely wasn't conscious intention 100% of the time. And I think it's just because that's kind of how it works. In a small town, someone will tell one story and it'll kind of inspire another person. It reminds them of another story that's maybe related because there's a cousin involved, or it happened near the same place or in the same year. And I think that's what happened with me as I was writing these stories. I realized, oh, well, this character kind of reminds me of this one. Maybe they're related. I should look into that. Or this happened and then this happened the next day, and the echoes of that narrative are still affecting this one. And it happened in a really natural and honestly pretty satisfying process, and I'm really, really satisfied with the result, but I can't fully explain it.
I think that's most art in general, where you kind of get to the end and you're like, oh, well, okay. Well, that worked out slightly differently than I was expecting, but great. Mm-hmm. Well, tell me about some of your specific characters, just ones that I really enjoyed overall. Toward the end of, let me find it here. I think it's the second to last story with the character Clemencia, and she's kind of come back to her family home, and she's got this interesting ability, I guess, where she remembers events and moments in detail and they replay in her mind. And that was one that I really enjoyed that story because it just had a lot of impact on the reader, at least through my experience, where you're going back to a place where you've had all of these memories, and what an interesting experience that would be in both positive and negative and in between ways of going back to that space and having that experience of reliving sweet moments or hard moments. And what an interesting idea to have an experience like that as you're trying to work through, everything that brings up. Anytime I think you go back to a place or a group of people that you haven't seen in a long time, it stirs up a lot, good or bad, depending on the place and the situation, probably. But that one was one that just I really connected with and found interesting. And so I wanted to ask you about that character particularly, and just where she came from with that interesting personality trait, or not personality trait necessarily, but just interesting character trait.
I'm really glad you liked that story. I think that one gets overlooked a little bit more than the other ones. It's not quite as fantastical. It's a little bit more grounded. And it was also the last story that I finished, actually. The first draft of it had Clemencia, but she wasn't quite fully fleshed out, and I couldn't figure her out for the longest time. And so I started imagining what was her whole life like? What are some things that happened in her childhood? What happened after that? And what led her to leaving her hometown? How was she taken away? How does she feel about that? She must be conflicted. And these scenes from her life just started manifesting before my eyes and before my hands at the keyboard. And I realized that I didn't necessarily need to pick which ones to include. I could weave each of them into the narrative. And that's how I came up with the concept of her having this kind of extraordinary memory where she's not only remembering things in her head, but she's seeing the people that were present during chapters of her life, and they're sitting beside her at the kitchen table as she's cleaning the house that's been abandoned for a decade or more. She's watching her father chop wood outside. Her mom is washing the dishes. And it's not just that she's remembering, she's reliving them again. And it's something that she's been able to do her whole life. And it was also what allowed me to finish the story. So it kind of has this very fitting, just, gosh, I'm not sure exactly how to finish that thought. It has a nice symmetry to it, the story's development and then its completion. And I'm really glad you liked that story. I really like it too.
Like the word you settled on with symmetry, it did feel very much like she comes into the situation with this kind of mess of emotions and thoughts and trying to figure out what to do and how to handle it, and not to ruin the ending or anything, but the resolution of the story feels very balanced, and it led really nicely into the final story. But it was interesting that one kind of gave this sense of closure, and then we get this one final piece at the very end to wrap up the book. They paired really nicely together in that order.
I'm glad you think so.
Well, one other thing that I wanted to ask you about, and it's something that I think authors get asked about a lot, is, oh, is this based on a person you know, or your own experience, or your own hometown, or, things like that. And I think it's a question for people who maybe don't have artistic pursuits or hobbies in that realm, that can be a strange process for someone who's not involved in that to understand, just as like there are many other interests that seem very foreign to me because I don't, I'm not involved in that to understand the intricacies and the process of working with it. And with yours, with this book, there are some aspects you mentioned in the introduction, maybe the right word is like reminiscent of your town that you grew up
Mhm.
in, and maybe some of your own experiences. But I wanted to ask you about that blending for you and how that worked and how you approached bringing in the culture and the stories and the experiences that you've seen throughout your life without it being a repetition of this place or what have you.
It's, yeah, it's when, let me think about this. That's a great question. There are definitely specific scenes in Dichos and Nichos where I know exactly where I am in my hometown. I know which dirt road I'm on. I know, if I can see the cross of the church in the distance, I know for sure where I'm at in town. But there are other scenes and other stories where I'm not exactly sure. And I think there's even some places where maybe I remember a place from one of the nearby villages instead of just Dixon. Maybe it's Velarde, maybe one of the other small towns nearby, Peñasco, where I went to high school. And I can recognize these places. And I know for sure that's where the characters are. Maybe they're in an orchard there, or sitting on a wall, or they're outside the local general store. I know for sure. And then there's other ones where I don't know exactly where I got that inspiration, but I still see them as clearly, even though they're not places I've ever been. And when it comes to the characters themselves, it's kind of the same thing. There's some of them that are very, very directly inspired by specific individuals, normally older people that I've known here in Dixon or in this area, and they're directly inspired. And then some of them have a little bit of me thrown in, they have a little bit of my friends thrown in, or just people I know around, but they are definitely their own character that isn't directly tied to a specific person. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it's always just such an interesting process to work through in your own mind. And so I'm always interested to hear how other writers approach it. Because it's like you can't help but incorporate some of your own experiences and the people that you've known over your lifetime into your writing, because that's where you find a lot of inspiration, is just everyday life. I think it shapes
Absolutely.
who we are and what we want to write about in a lot of ways. And everybody's answer is always a little bit different. I just find that really fascinating to see how other creative mind works and how we all approach that just, slightly differently sometimes. And then for some, really drastically different. It's just a fun
Mhm.
conversation to have. Well, and the other thing that I wanted to ask you about is each of the stories not only has the specific dicho that it focuses on, and some of them have multiple throughout the story. Was there a thought process as you started approaching this? Was the theme for the individual stories pre-selected? Was that based on the artwork and then you built the story around it? Or just what was that process of kind of choosing the focus for each one?
Each story was different. Some of them, the image came first. Maybe my father had a sketch and he really wanted to have this image of someone doing something specific. One I remember specifically is he really wanted to paint a coyote and a crow facing off with one another. He just had it in him. He had that image ready to go right in the barrel. And so he pitched it to me, and I was able to craft a narrative around that and a detail around that. And then there were other times where I had a dicho ready, and it was good enough right away that I knew it had to fit somewhere in the story, and so I would talk to my parents about it and see how we can fit that in and what poignant images there might be that could be tied to it. And of course, every time we were trying to develop a painting and a story, the frame came into play too, because whatever we were doing, we had to make it fit into what my mom Kristen was building, whether that's an antique cabinet or the lanterns or some old carpenter's box. We had to work with that too. And it never felt forced. Looking back, I don't think we ever really had any roadblocks either. It was just kind of this ongoing process that just went and went and went and kept gathering momentum, and it just kept getting easier and easier. And like I said, we've collaborated before, and Dichos and Nichos was actually right at the tail end of another large scale collaboration we did for the second part of my first novel, which hasn't been published yet, titled El Ocio. And we finished that in 2019, and my dad had the pitch for Dichos and Nichos right after that. So we kind of just steamrolled right into the next one. I think we all just enjoyed working together so much and had so much imagination left over that we were able to just keep going, basically. So it never felt forced. It all happened in a very natural way, and it happened in a million different ways. It's hard to pinpoint exactly the source of each of the inspirations.
Oh, that's really neat. And how cool that you guys can work together so well. I think that's really hard to find in the world.
Yeah, we recognize again and again how special it is to us and how lucky we are to be able to work together like that. It's amazing.
I hope you continue to do that and are able to do more projects together, because this my first glimpse at your collaborations has been really an interesting experience. And I wanted to ask you, I know it's always impossible to choose a favorite per se, but is there one of the stories that you would like to mention and make sure that, readers or listeners and readers hear about before we start to wrap up?
That's a good question. I'm going to give you two answers. I can't pick just one. I think that the story that will have the widest appeal is the story about Esposa, who's on the cover. And I just think that it's very accessible. I think that a lot of people are just going to like it immediately. And of course, because it's on the cover, they'll be interested in it right away. And I'm really proud of that story. It's one of the longer stories in there, and I do really like it a lot, so I had to mention it. And it's titled Las Frutas y el Disfrute. That's the Spanish title, and translated into English, that's Fruits and Fancies. So look out for that one for sure. But if I had to pick a favorite, it would be the last story in the book. And I think it's the shortest story, and it's definitely the simplest story. But there's a reason it goes at the end, and it had a big influence on me, a big impact for me as I was writing it, and it affected me personally a great deal. So I urge everyone, don't skip ahead to get to that one, but please do work your way through the book. And then I hope you do read that last one, because it has a lot of meaning to me personally, and I guess I could say it's my favorite. I'm not exactly sure. I could have a different answer tomorrow, but for today, that's my favorite.
I love that answer. And both of those two, those were ones that I enjoyed all of them, but those two did stick out to me as well. And they're ones that I'll be thinking about for a while. Esposa's story is definitely thought provoking, especially in today's current climate and things going on.
Yeah.
Just thinking about putting ourselves in other people's experiences a little bit more and having some better understanding and compassion. That's always a good lesson to remind ourselves of.
Yeah. And, it's got some romance in there too. And,
Mm-hmm.
whether they admit it or not, everybody loves a little romance.
Very true. Well, and Sage, we are just about out of time. So before we wrap up, what are you working on now? And is there anything we can give listeners a chance to keep an eye out for?
Yeah. So by day, I'm an elementary school librarian, and I also run an after-school program through my public library. So that takes up a lot of my time. And you know a little bit about working with kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
Takes a lot of time and a lot of energy,
It does.
but we make it work. If you really want to be a writer, you make it work no matter what. So I do that. I do that during the day. I also spend a fair bit of my time restoring the historic adobe structures on my property here in Dixon. I have some old houses here on the plaza that I'm personally working to basically save from entropy. I'm trying to give them a fresh breath of life, basically. And that feels like its own kind of storytelling, honoring the past by breathing new life into it. But in terms of writing that I'm working on, I have 3 major projects. I have a large, I call it an epic. It's getting to the point where it needed a new word, but it's a large novel. It's titled El Ocio. And I mentioned earlier that I had done 2 collaborations with my parents on it. So there's over 20 art pieces like those in Dichos and Nichos that is tied to El Ocio. And that is a nearly finished manuscript. I can't help but open it up every once in a while and tweak some things. But that will be the next thing I'm querying. And I hope to have an agent with me when I do that. Then I have a slightly shorter novel called Fabulórico, which is in the magical realism genre, and it's set in New Mexico around the turn of the 20th century. And then lastly, I have a historical fiction piece that I'm laying the groundwork for about the New Mexico lawman El Fego Baca. And all 3 of these books have artwork that my parents created. So they all were created collaboratively or will be finished collaboratively. And yeah, that's what I've got going on. I have plans for a few more things, but I'll wait to mention anything about those.
All right. Well, wonderful. You definitely stay busy, and those all sound like interesting projects to look forward to. So I hope you stay in contact. I'd be happy to have you back to talk about your next project when you're ready.
I'd love to. This was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Well, and tell people where they can find you online so they can keep up with what you're doing.
Okay. The easiest way will be to go to my website, which is sagevogel.com. I was lucky enough to have an unusual enough name that I could snag that domain. So sagevogel.com, you can keep up to date there and get access to my other social media accounts. And be sure, if you can, to come to my events at Collected Works and Bookworks on March 23rd and March 29th, respectively.
Well, thank you so much. I hope people take a minute to check out Dichos and Nichos and come talk to you if they're in the area later this month. And I wish you the best in your future projects. I'm excited to hear more about them.
Well, thank you so much, and right back at you.